Hello, welcome to 10 at 10. My name is Michael Ramage. I am the director of the Cyber Education and Research Center at Murray State University, and welcome back to 10 at 10. 10 at 10 is brought to you through a partnership between Murray State University, Grow West, the Technology Council of West Kentucky, KY Innovation, and our local partners, Sprocket Innovation in Paducah and the Kentucky Innovation Station in Madisonville. Last week, we started going back over the 5 basic cybersecurity tips that we should take to keep our business and our organization um, safe and secure. I told you last week that beginning this week we would start looking at those individual items, and so this week we want to start with creating a security policy. Now, when I talk about creating a security policy, I, there's so much that goes into that. And it's not just going sit down and creating a single policy. There's really several pieces that go into that, and I want to talk through that a little bit today. Obviously, you can hear my voice a little hoarse. I apologize for that, but I want to make sure that I walk through these things today and give you a piece of um, what it would take for you to create a policy for your organization. Um, as I said last week, policy is not fun. It's not the most exciting part of cybersecurity. It's not even in the top 10 most exciting parts of cybersecurity, but it is one of the most important. And so that, for that reason, I want to give it a little bit of attention today. So, first of all, before you can really start creating policy, you need to know what it is that you're protecting. So I always suggest the very first thing that you do is to do an inventory asset, so that you know where your assets are, and also an inventory of your data so that you know what you're trying to protect. Questions for you to ask: what needs to be protected? All right. Does that mean physical items? Yes, it does. Does that mean logical or data or non-physical items? Yes, it does. Um, the files that you're keeping, the customer data that you're keeping, all of those types of things need to be protected, not just the server they're residing on. And we'll get more into that in a minute. Uh, the second question is, who is allowed to access it? So, if you're talking about a physical server, who actually needs to touch that physical server? Most organizations have their servers, well, a lot of organizations now actually have their servers in the cloud, so you can't even get to them if you wanted to. But those that have them on site, they're behind a locked door because in today's world, you don't actually have to touch that server to do what you need to do with the data that's on it. Um, but also the data. Who should have access to that data? Who doesn't need access to that data? A lot of times there's a need to know. So just because you're a vice president or just because you're the owner of a company, do you need to have access to that data? Maybe not. Just because um, they're a doctor, do they need access to that patient's data? Maybe not. If that patient is not one of their patients, then there's not a need to know. But who's allowed to access it? And then finally, where is that data stored? And that where is it stored is an important piece because as we walk through policies, one of the things that we need to do is to make sure that we're backing up that data, for one. And a second piece is it depends on the type of data that it is, but there's some data that's not allowed to be stored outside the United States. If you don't know what type of server that data is being stored on, it actually could be stored outside the United States without you even knowing. For example, Google um, does not typically block their data, meaning it may be hosted in the United States, but it also may be redundantly hosted outside of the U.S. So if you're trying to follow a federal regulation that has an export control component, you may be violating that without even knowing it. So it's important to know where that data is stored. Um, Including risk assessment and threat management processes are important as well. Um, when you're thinking about what it is that you're trying to protect, you need to have a thought about who are you protecting it from? Who would benefit from stealing this data? Who would benefit from your company's network going down, from your website going down? Is it just some random hacker, or is it a competitor? Is it government sponsored? Are you doing something where a hacktivist group might not like it? Having that risk assessment, threat management process in place as well is certainly something to consider as you're going through this. And then, based on those items, you need to create appropriate policies, a data privacy policy. I hope you have a data privacy policy. If you have protected data, if you have data that includes personally identifiable information, health information, financial information, education records, I hope that your organization has a data privacy policy. If you don't, you need to develop one as soon as possible because you may be in violation of some federal laws and not even know it. Second, I hope you have an acceptable use policy. What's an acceptable use policy? So if you have somebody that comes in, if you're a library and somebody's coming in to use your computer, what are the rules that what can they do on that computer and what can they not do on that computer? The acceptable use policy will spell that out. But the same thing goes to your employees. If you're a small business, what can people do on your computers and what can they not do? I hope that you know that because, frankly, you can't hold people responsible if you haven't already told them what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and what are the punishments. An incident response. We hope you never have an incident. The goal would be that you never have an incident, but you're likely to have an incident at some point. How do you respond? It is much better to have a policy in place so that you can just go on autopilot and respond in the way that you've trained, in the way that you've prepared and planned, instead of trying to make it up as you go. Having a backup policy. Those items that you identified in your inventory that are important to your company, hopefully you're backing those files up. That's a very important thing. Now, securing those backup files and doing all of that as well, but that's an important piece. Maybe that's all the policies you have, but there's a lot of other ones that you could have and maybe should have. BYOD, bring your own device. If I bring my phone into the building, can I connect it to the network? Is that okay? Or is that against the rules? If you're a remote worker, now in the world of COVID, a lot of us are remote workers. As a remote worker, what can you do on your home network? What do you have to VPN for? What does that look like? Having that social media policy. You would be amazed at how many passwords are shared directly and indirectly on social media. What is allowed to be shared on social media? What is not allowed? Can they talk about the company? Can they not? If they talk about the company, then do you also hold them responsible for other things? There's a lot that goes into social media that, frankly, we don't think about very much. And then drug and alcohol, workplace safety, sexual harassment. There's a lot of other policies that aren't specifically tied to technology that you should think about. But let me wrap up with saying this. There's a lot of confusion when it comes to policies. The policy is the general management statement about what is acceptable and not acceptable. A policy could be 1 page, a policy could be 50 pages. What a lot of companies are doing now is that they'll have a policy, and then building on the policy will be the standards, the procedures, the guidelines, and the baselines. Maybe in a month or so, after we get through all of these items that we want to talk about here at the beginning of the year, we'll go over those differences. I do think it's important to understand those differences. But today, we are only talking about the policy. We're only talking about those specific policies that are going to guide the direction of our security for our business. Next week, we start talking about passwords. And then when we start talking about implementing technology, it's hard to implement technology, security wise or otherwise, if we don't have the policies in place first to understand what we're trying to accomplish with those or with that technology, because it should all be guided by our overall policy of our organization. So I hope that's been helpful. We'll certainly talk more about this, but if you have questions, if something wasn't clear today, certainly let me know, and we'll try to go over it a little bit more in more detail. But I appreciate you joining in today. Come back next week. We'll talk about policies. Or no, I'm sorry, not policies. We'll talk about passwords next week, and I hope you join us back here for 10 at 10. Thank you very much. Bye.